Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
A peculiar intellectual stasis seemed to afflict the formal study of literature in the middle years of the 20th century. The field, aspiring to the rigor of a modern academic discipline, found itself suspended between two powerful, yet ultimately confining orthodoxies. On one side stood the formidable edifice of new criticism, a school that had performed the invaluable service of returning critical attention to the literary work itself. With the intensity of a watchmaker and the precision of a surgeon, the new critic would dissect the poem or the novel as a self-contained verbal artifact. The focus was on ambiguity, irony, tension, and paradox, the intricate internal mechanics that gave the text its aesthetic power. This method yielded readings of unparalleled depth and sensitivity, illuminating the complex interplay of words on the page. Its practitioners taught a generation how to read with profound attentiveness. This immense achievement derived from a resolutely inward gaze. Each great work was treated as an exquisitely mapped island universe, separate from any larger continent of meaning. Consequently, connections between works were confined to vague aesthetic comparisons, and a framework for understanding literature as a collective human endeavor remained elusive. Alongside this intense, microscopic focus existed the long-established tradition of historical and biographical scholarship. Here, a literary work was understood as a product, a consequence of external forces. To comprehend Shakespeare, one must comprehend Elizabethan England. To grasp Milton, one must delve into the sectarian violence of the English Civil War. The author's life, their psychological state, the economic conditions of their era, these were the causal agents, and the text was their evidentiary footprint. This perspective provided essential context, anchoring literature in the tangible world of human experience and historical process. Its limitation, however, was a persistent tendency toward a kind of imaginative reductionism. The work of art risked becoming a document, a symptom of its age, with its unique imaginative autonomy subsumed by the history that produced it. The poem was explained away by the poet's biography. The novel became an illustration of a sociological trend. The literary object perpetually pointed away from itself, its value derived from its external reflections, which overshadowed its intrinsic being. The student of literature encountered two prevailing approaches: a brilliant hermetic analysis of the isolated text and a comprehensive, deterministic explanation that focused on everything surrounding the work's imaginative core. The field required a conceptual bridge, a unifying theory, to account for the integrity of the individual work alongside the coherent, ordered totality of literature. The field possessed brilliant tactics for textual analysis and a wealth of historical data, yet awaited a grand strategy, a central hypothesis, and its own organizing principles. Physics had its laws of motion and energy, and biology its principles of evolution and genetics. Literature, in this context, was perceived as a collection of discrete miracles and a passive reflection of other, more powerful forces. Into this intellectual landscape stepped the Canadian critic Northrop Frye, and with the publication of his 1957 magnum opus, Anatomy of Criticism's 4 essays, he proposed a solution of breathtaking ambition and startling originality. The book's very title signals its methodological audacity. An anatomy implies a systematic, structural investigation, a laying bare of the constituent parts of a body to understand the principles of its organization. This was precisely Frye's aim. He argued for radical reconception of literature itself. He invited his readers to imagine the entirety of literary creation, from the earliest myths to the latest novel, as a single, interconnected body. This order of words, constituted an autonomous universe, a self-contained imaginative reality governed by its own internal laws and structures. Frye's proposition was as simple as it was revolutionary. The task of the critic was to be a kind of literary scientist. The critic's role was to explore this verbal universe with the same systematic spirit a biologist brings to the natural world. A biologist approaches a new organism with systematic inquiry, asking about its phylum, its species, its relationship to its environment, and its structural principles. The scientific task proceeds from these objective questions, setting aside subjective evaluations. Similarly, Frye contended that the endless cycle of evaluative, taste-based criticism which dominated so much literary discussion was a pre-scientific activity. This approach, a component of the reading experience, offered a limited path for developing a coherent field of knowledge. The true business of criticism, he argued, was to discover and articulate the fundamental patterns, the recurring symbols, the underlying narrative shapes, and the archetypal structures that literature uses again and again. These were the literary equivalent of atoms, cells, or natural laws. They were the building blocks of the imagination. Frye envisioned a poetics in the Aristotelian sense that would be systematic, objective, and cumulative. It would be a body of knowledge that could be taught, learned, and built upon by subsequent generations of scholars. A critic, armed with this framework, could see how a Greek tragedy, a medieval romance, and a Hollywood Western, for all their surface differences, might draw upon the same fundamental narrative structure the same archetypal quest. This approach promised to resolve the central dilemma of mid-century criticism. It honored the new critic's demand for close attention to the text because the archetypes and patterns are found within the work. It satisfied the historical scholar's desire for a larger context with a framework internal to literature itself, a vast, echoing chamber of myth and genre. The imagination, in Frye's view, had its own history, its own memory, its own recurring dreams. A poet writing today is in dialogue consciously or unconsciously with the entire tradition that precedes them, using a symbolic language that has been developing for millennia. Frye's project was therefore an assertion of the autonomy and authority of the literary imagination. He sought to create a comprehensive map of the world of literature, a conceptual schema that would render the whole territory intelligible. With such a map, any individual work could be located, its coordinates fixed in relation to the whole. The critic could navigate the chaos of masterpieces with a new sense of order and direction. To construct this grand, systematic anatomy, however, required a foundational principle of organization. Before one could classify the myriad species of narrative, one needed a way to arrange them across the vast expanse of time. The first and most essential task was to develop a coherent theory of literary history itself, a framework for understanding how the fundamental stories humanity tells have evolved. This initial, powerful ordering principle would become the first major pillar of his entire critical system. This grand endeavor to chart the entirety of literary expression began with a fundamental question of history. To classify the forms of storytelling, one first needs a principle that accounts for their changes over time. Frye's initial masterstroke was the formulation of a system for historical criticism, a way to organize the sprawling narrative of Western literature from its origins to the modern era. He proposed that the crucial variable, the conceptual yardstick against which all fictions could be measured, was a hero's power of action, the relationship between the protagonist's abilities and the laws of his environment, as well as his stature relative to the audience, provides the key. This single, elegant principle yielded a sequence of 5 distinct fictional modes, each dominating a particular epoch of Western culture, and together forming a vast, cyclical pattern of historical development. The cycle begins at the apex with the mode of myth. Here, the protagonist is a divine being, a character superior in kind to other people and to the environment of other people. The stories of Zeus, Apollo, or the created deities of various pantheons belong to this category. Their actions are bound by a logic entirely their own, a supernatural causality that operates above and beyond the constraints of the physical world we know. They create, destroy, and transform reality through sheer will. We, the audience, look up to these figures as beings of a completely different order. This is the literature of a world still infused with the sacred, where the primary actors are the gods themselves. Following myth, as the imaginative lens lowers slightly, we enter the world of romance. In this mode, the hero is a human being, yet one who is superior in degree to other people and whose environment. This is the domain of the marvelous, the realm of legend, folktale, and chivalric adventure. The hero of romance, such as Lancelot, Beowulf, or Siegfried, achieves astonishing feats that are recognizably human achievements amplified to their highest possible potential. He moves through an enchanted world where the ordinary laws of nature are frequently and gracefully suspended. He battles dragons, consults with wizards, or wields a magic sword, demonstrating courage, virtue, and prowess that are human qualities magnified to a heroic scale. The audience looks up, filled with wonder at a figure who embodies an ideal of human capability. The historical descent continues into the high mimetic mode. Here, the hero is a leader, superior in authority, passion, and power of expression to others, and remains subject to the same natural order and social critique as his fellow human beings. This is the mode of high tragedy and national epic. The protagonists are kings, princes, and generals, figures like Oedipus, Hamlet, or Milton's ADM. Their elevated stature gives their fall a tragic resonance that reverberates through the whole of society. Their choices have immense public consequences. We perceive them as figures of great rank and significance, whose flaws and ultimate subjection to fate, mortality, and the laws of nature make them profoundly familiar. They are great individuals, trapped within the same cage of physical and social reality that confines us all. Lowering the gaze further, we arrive at the low mimetic mode. In this sphere, the hero is one of us. He or she exists on an equal plane with other people and with the environment. The protagonists are ordinary men and women, and we view them as equals on a plane of common humanity. This is the mode of most comedy in a realistic fiction, the world portrayed by novelists like Jane Austen, Gustave Flaubert, or Henry James. The characters operate within a familiar social structure and are bound by all its conventions and limitations. Their conflicts are personal, their triumphs and failures those of the everyday. The power at play is the power of wit, of social maneuvering, or of individual perseverance against the pressures of a thoroughly demystified world. The focus is on the intricate workings of the human community as it actually appears. Finally, the cycle reaches its nadir in the ironic mode. Here, the protagonist is inferior in power or intelligence to ourselves, so that we have the sense of looking down on a scene of bondage, frustration, or absurdity. This is the literature of the anti-hero, the victim, the fool. We encounter the protagonists of Kafka, trapped in inexplicable bureaucratic labyrinths, or the tramps of Beckett, waiting for a savior whose arrival is forever deferred. The hero is caught in a world that is nonsensical, oppressive, or indifferent, a condition that stifles meaningful action. This mode explores the depths of human subjugation, alienation, and the collapse of the heroic ideal altogether. The world presented is one where the structures of society, and even reality itself, seem designed to thwart human agency. Frye's great insight was to see this progression as a complete, recurring historical narrative. Western literature begins with myths of gods, descends through the demigods of romance, the kings of tragedy, and the citizens of realism until it arrives at the isolated, ineffectual individual of the ironic age. At this lowest point, a remarkable transformation begins. The ironic hero, in his total hopelessness, often takes on the characteristics of a scapegoat or a sacrificial victim, a figure whose suffering seems to have a broader, communal significance. In this suffering, the ironic figure begins to resemble the dying and resurrected gods of ancient myth. The image of the absurd anti-hero starts to blend into the image of the martyred deity, and thus irony begins to modulate back towards myth. The great wheel of literary history turns, and the cycle is poised to begin anew. This modal theory provided Frye with his diachronic, or historical, axis, a powerful framework for situating any literary work along the grand timeline of cultural imagination. It established a coherent pattern for the evolution of narrative, a foundational structure upon which the rest of this critical anatomy could be built. Having mapped the horizontal plane of history, the next task was to chart the vertical dimensions of meaning within the literary artifact itself. With a historical sweep of literary modes established, a different kind of inquiry presents itself. The inquiry then turns to the very nature of a work's internal significance. A literary artifact is a complex constellation of words and images, capable of radiating meaning in multiple directions simultaneously. This very richness, this polysemous quality, posed one of the central dilemmas for 20th century criticism. In an environment teeming with competing interpretations, many of them grounded in personal taste, biographical speculation, or moralistic judgment, the study of literature often appeared to be an enterprise in search of a coherent, principled foundation. The danger was a descent into pure relativism, a state where a text could mean anything, with its definitive meaning becoming elusive. A critic might champion a psychological reading, another a sociological one, and a third an aesthetic one, creating disparate dialogues with few points of intersection. The field risked becoming a collection of isolated pronouncements, a chorus of voices speaking past one another. Frye confronted this intellectual chaos by seeking a framework for interpretation that was systematic and capacious. He envisioned a critical practice grounded in the objective study, the literary work itself, and organized according to a logical progression of understanding. His solution was a theory of symbolism that organizes criticism into 4 distinct, yet interconnected phases. These phases represent different contexts or layers of meaning, each with its own specific focus and analytical direction. Together, they form a comprehensive methodology for moving from the most immediate encounter with a text to the most universal vision of literature's place in human civilization. He called this the ethical framework of criticism, using the word ethical in its older sense, pertaining to the ethos or total character of a society's imaginative life, a complete vision of what is possible. The first phase is the literal and descriptive. This is the initial point of contact, the foundation upon which all other understanding is built. At this level, the critic examines the text as a sequence of words pointing outward toward the phenomenal world. The descriptive aspect concerns the relationship between the language and the reality it purports to represent. A novel by Zoller, for example, makes a strong claim to descriptive accuracy. Its language functioning is a window onto a specific social milieu. The literal aspect, a subtly distinct concept for Frye, refers to the plain, grammatical sense of the words on the page, the meaning you might find by consulting a dictionary and a grammar book. It is the direct rendering of the narrative, detailing what a character said, where they went, and what they did. This phase establishes the basic semantic identity of the work. It is the necessary starting point, the raw data of the literary experience. A critic who bypasses this phase for immediate symbolic cunning risks building an elaborate interpretive edifice on a foundation of sand. From this outward-looking perspective, the critical focus pivots inward to the second phase, the formal. Here, the symbol is understood as an image within a self-contained aesthetic pattern. The direction of meaning turns inward, pointing toward the work's own internal structure. The critic's task becomes the analysis of the text as an artifact, a unified composition of rhythm, imagery, and narrative design. A poem by John Donne, for instance, might be analyzed at this level through the intricate logic of its central conceit, the interplay of its metrical patterns, and the resolution of its thematic tensions. The meaning resides in the coherence of the form itself. The work is treated as a hypothetical object, a verbal contraption whose parts are all internally related. This is the essence of formalist analysis, the explication of the work as a singular, autonomous whole. It answers the question, how does this particular arrangement of words create its unique effect, having established the internal unity of the work? The third phase expands the context once more. This is the archetypal phase, where the symbol is understood as a recurring motif that connects the individual work to the entire universe of literature. The direction of meaning again points outward, this time toward other literary works. The critic identifies images, characters, and plot structures that are conventional, that have appeared in countless other stories, poems, and plays throughout history. The shepherd in a pastoral poem the questing knight in a romance, and the sacrificial hero in a tragedy are all archetypes. They are communicative units that literature uses to speak to itself. An analysis of Shakespeare's The Tempest in this phase would explore Prospero's lineage from other magician figures, Miranda's connection to the archetypal innocent maiden, and the island's relation to other enchanted spaces in romance and epic. This phase situates the individual text within a vast, inherited tradition, revealing it as a single episode in humanity's continuous and collective story. Literature becomes a self-generating system, a world made of words that is parallel to the world of things. The final, most expansive context is the anagogic phase. Here, the symbol is treated as a monet, a microcosm that contains within it the macrocosm of all possible imaginative experience. At this level, literature is conceived as a total, unified, and limitless order of words, a single, all-encompassing body of which every individual work is a part. This is the ultimate vision of literature as a form of secular scripture, a complete, incoherent model of human desire, aspiration, and civilization. The direction of meaning becomes all-encompassing. The archetypes of the previous phase are now seen as components of a single, central myth, the story of humanity's quest to build its ideal world. A symbol like a city, for instance, is understood anagogically as representing the universal human drive for civic order and community. The garden represents the ideal of a harmonious relationship with nature. This phase treats the whole of literature as a unified imaginative cosmology, a verbal universe that contains everything the human mind can conceive. Is the ultimate answer to the question, what is the purpose of literature for Frye? Its purpose is to articulate the full range of what humanity imagines and desires. This four-part structure provided a disciplined pathway for the critic, a way to navigate the complexities of meaning with rigor and clarity. The archetypal phase, with its focus on the connections between texts, proved especially fertile, for it implied the existence of a master code, a comprehensive grammar of literary plots and images. To chart the grammar would be the next great step. The intellectual quest for a master code, a comprehensive grammar of literary forms, led Frye toward the most fundamental and universally shared human experience. If literature as a whole formed a coherent verbal universe, then its primary structures ought to reflect a pattern equally profound and primordial. The challenge was immense. Critics before him had observed the uncanny recurrence of certain plot formulas, character types, and symbolic images across wildly disparate cultures and epochs. The story of a hero's journey, the image of a life-giving garden, the figure of a wise elder, and the narrative of a dying and resurrected deity appeared with a persistence suggesting a source deeper than cultural borrowing or coincidence. This suggested the existence of a common imaginative inheritance, a set of narrative building blocks that were somehow innate to the act of storytelling itself. To chart this inheritance, to map its contours, and reveal its underlying logic, was the monumental task Frye set for himself in his theory of archetypes. His central insight was that these recurring elements, which he termed archetypes, were the basic components of mythology. An archetype, in its formulation, is a symbol, character, or plot pattern that possesses a universal resonance, connecting one literary work to another and thereby weaving them into a larger, integrated tapestry of meaning. The city, the flood, the quest, and the hero are archetypal. Their power lies in their ability to evoke a vast web of associations that extends far beyond the confines of a single text. For Frye, all of literature was a displacement of mythology. By displacement, he meant the adaptation of these raw, primal mythic stories into more plausible, socially acceptable, and realistic forms. A gritty detective novel, for instance, could be understood as a displaced form of a heroic quest romance, with the private eye as the knight, the corrupt city as the dragon-haunted wilderness, and the solved case as the recovery of a hidden treasure. Through this lens, the whole of literature revealed itself as a single, sprawling family of stories, all descended from a common ancestor, the monomyth. The crucial step was to identify the structure of this monomyth. If there was one great story underlying all others, what shape did it take? Frye located the answer in the cyclical rhythm of the natural world, the daily cycle of the sun, the lunar cycle of the moon, and, most importantly, the annual cycle of the seasons provided the ultimate template for narrative. This cycle, representing the eternal pattern of birth, growth, decay, and death, followed by rebirth, is the deepest story humanity knows, imprinted upon our consciousness by the very environment that sustains us. It offered Frye an objective, almost biological, foundation for his literary system. He proposed that the monomyth is a quest narrative that follows the seasonal pattern, and that its four distinct phases correspond to the four seasons, which in turn generate the four great master plots, or mythi, of literature. The first of these is the mythos of spring, which finds its generic expression in comedy. This is the narrative of life's triumphant return. It depicts a movement from a state of bondage or confusion to one of liberation and clarity. The plot typically begins with a society dominated by absurd laws, irrational customs, or tyrannical, older figures who block the desires of the young protagonists. The comedic action worked to overthrow these obstacles, culminating in a festive conclusion, frequently a wedding feast or a dance. This final celebration symbolizes the integration of the hero and heroine into a new, revitalized social order. It is the literary equivalent of spring's ascendance, a reassertion of fertility, youth, and social harmony. Shakespeare's comedies, with their journeys through enchanted forests and their final scenes of multiple marriages, are the quintessential examples of this mythos. Following spring is the mythos of summer, the genre of romance. This is the zenith of the cycle, a world of idealized adventure and wish fulfillment. Here, the hero, often of noble or mysterious birth, embarks on a perilous quest in a world where the lines between good and evil are starkly drawn. The landscape of romance is one of marvels and terror's enchanted castles, fearsome dragons, beautiful princesses, and demonic villains. The hero's success is paramount, and the narrative arc follows a three-part structure: the perilous journey, the crucial struggle with the enemy, and the final exaltation of the hero. The legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, with their quests for the Holy Grail and their battles against monstrous foes, perfectly embody the spirit of romance. It is the literature of the high noon of the imagination, a world where courage is always rewarded and the ideal is made manifest. As summer fades into autumn, the literary cycle moves into the mythos of tragedy. This is the narrative of decline, fall, and catastrophe. Its central movement depicts the hero's exclusion from society, a fall from a position of greatness into isolation and death. The tragic hero is a figure of high stature who, through some flaw or error in judgment, the classical Hammarscher sets in motion a chain of events that leads to their ruin. The world of tragedy is governed by an inexorable order, a sense of fate or natural law that the hero violates, knowingly or unknowingly, at their peril. The atmosphere is one of awe and terror, as we witness the dismantling of a great individual. Sophocles' Oedipus falls from the pinnacle of kingship to the depths of blindness and exile, and Shakespeare's King Lear, stripped of his power and cast out into the storm, are the archetypal figures of this autumnal world. Finally, the cycle descends into the mythos of winter, the world of irony and satire. This is the narrative of darkness, chaos, and bondage, a world from which the heroic ideal has vanished. In this phase, society is presented as a prison, a madhouse, or a wasteland, and the protagonists are powerless, frustrated, or absurd. Satire is the Milton side of this mythos, actively mocking the failed ideals and hollowed-out conventions of a corrupt world. It attacks a folly and vice with a weapon of ridicule. Irony, its more subtle companion, presents this world of collapse through implication, showing humanity in a state of complete subjugation to a meaningless or hostile reality. The bewildering bureaucracies of Kafka's novels or the bleak, cyclical emptiness of Beckett's plays represent the dead of winter in the literary imagination. It is a world awaiting a spring whose arrival remains uncertain. Together, these four mythoi form a complete, incoherent circle, a synchronic map of all narrative possibilities. Comedy's happy ending leads to the idealized world of romance. The hero of romance, in their pride, can fall into tragedy, and the world left after the tragic catastrophe is the ironic wasteland from which a new society, the world of comedy, must struggle to be born. With this elegant and powerful model, Frye provided a tool for seeing the entire landscape of literature as a unified field. Any story from any culture or period could be located on this conceptual map, its deep structure revealed by its position within the great seasonal cycle. It explained what stories are ultimately about: the human quest to build a desirable world and to understand the forces that threaten it. This powerful framework for understanding narrative content thus established a system, leaving the very manner of its telling as the next fundamental aspect of literature requiring systematization. With the mythoi, Frye had mapped the internal territory of narrative, the what of the story. The question of the how, the formal relationship between a work of art and its public, remained a landscape of confusing and often contradictory signposts. The very term genre was a source of profound intellectual disarray. For centuries, generic categories had been defined by a loose collection of criteria, shifting with the winds of taste and tradition. A tragedy was identified by its sorrowful plot and a high station of its hero, a comedy by its happy resolution. A sonnet was defined by its 14 lines and rhyme scheme, a novel by its prose and length. These descriptions, some useful and some arbitrary, represented a collection of disparate standards that awaited a unifying principle of classification. They were akin to organizing a library by the color of the book covers. The field awaited a more foundational logic, a universal key to the external forms of literature. Frye's response to this chaos was a theory of breathtaking simplicity and explanatory power. He proposed that the authentic basis for generic distinction lies in what he termed the radical of presentation. This wonderfully precise phrase refers to the primary, irreducible rhetorical condition in which a work is communicated to its audience. The essential variable is the relationship of the speaker to the listener, the writer to the reader. By isolating this formal principle, Frye could construct a coherent system of genres based on the fundamental circumstances of literary utterance. This approach centered the discussion on the objective, structural conditions of the artistic act itself. He identified 4 primary radicals of presentation, each giving rise to a major generic category, forming a complete spectrum of literary communication. The first and most ancient of these is the genre of epos. Here, the radical of presentation is direct address. The words are spoken by a poet, a bard, a storyteller, or a rhapsodist, and they are aimed at a listening audience physically present before the speaker. The Iliad and the Odyssey, in their original context, were performed, chanted to the accompaniment of a lyre. The voice of the author, or the author's surrogate, fills the air and unites the community. The verb tense recounts the great deeds of ancestors in the past. The act of telling itself is intensely present. This is the genre of the tribal campfire, the mead hall, the public square. The relationship is one of proclamation. The work exists as a shared, communal, oral experience. The author speaks and the people listen. With the invention of writing and the proliferation of the printing press, a new radical of presentation became dominant, giving rise to the genre Frye calls fiction. The word itself, derived from the Latin for something made or shaped, points to its nature as a crafted artifact. In fiction, the author writes for a reader. The audience is absent, an individual holding a book, often in solitude. The author's voice is mediated through the printed text. A silent and stable medium, the novel is the quintessential form of fiction. The bond between creator and consumer is indirect, private, and asynchronous. The author speaks, in a sense, to an indeterminate audience, and the reader overhears this written communication at their own leisure. This shift from the public square to the private study represents a fundamental change in the social conditions of literature, a change Frye's system elegantly captures. The genre of fiction presupposes literacy and a technology for mass reproduction. The third category is drama. In a play, the radical of presentation is one of enacted and witnessed story. The author, as a direct speaker, has vanished completely. On the stage, we hear the voices of Hamlet and Ophelia. The characters speak to one another within the world of the play, and the audience is a spectator to their interactions. The author is effaced, concealed behind the artifice of the performance. The words are written to be spoken by actors, and the work is designed to be seen and heard by an assembled crowd. The relationship is triangular. Characters interact, and the audience observes. The author's presence is felt through the architecture of the plot and the poetry of the dialogue. Drama, therefore, is a presented illusion, a world of action that unfolds before us as though we were invisible onlookers. Finally, Frye identifies the genre of the lyric. This is perhaps the most subtle of his distinctions. In the lyric, the radical of presentation is that of the overheard utterance. The poet, the speaker of the poem, has, in a rhetorical sense, turned their back on the audience. The words are addressed internally to the self, or to a specific other who is often absent, such as a lover, a muse, or God. The audience is in the position of an eavesdropper, catching fragments of a private meditation, a passionate outburst, or a solitary reflection. This explains the characteristic intensity, intimacy, and often fragmented nature of the lyric poem. It is the genre of the thinking or feeling mind in process, which we experience by overhearing the poet speak. This foundational posture accounts for the unique power of the form, from Sappho's fragments to Keats's odes. These four genres of epos, fiction, drama, and lyric constitute a complete and logical system based on a single, coherent principle. They are pure forms, ideal types defined by their rhetorical stance. In practice, literary works are complex hybrids. A novel, the dominant form of fiction, may contain intensely lyrical passages of interior monologue or sharply dramatic scenes of dialogue. An epic poem may be read silently like fiction. A modern poet at a reading performs a lyric, lending it an element of epos. Frye's framework allows for this complexity. It provides the analytical tools to dissect a work and understand its constituent generic elements. By understanding the radical of presentation, a critic can discern the dominant mode of the work and appreciate how it blends or plays with the conventions of others. This theory provided a stable, structural grammar for discussing the external forms of literature, a necessary complement to the internal, narrative grammar of the mythoi. With his anatomy of narrative content and rhetorical form now established, Frye had built the foundations of a unified science of criticism. The next step was to articulate its ultimate purpose, to explain the function of this vast, interconnected verbal universe within human civilization itself. Having constructed this immense, intricate edifice of literary theory, a veritable anatomy of the human imagination, Frye confronted the ultimate question of purpose. What is the function of this vast, interconnected verbal universe within civilization itself? If criticism is to be a coherent field of study and authentic science, it must possess a social mission, a reason for being with an impact outside the cloistered halls of the academy. The answer to this profound inquiry would occupy Frye for the remainder of his career, leading to two of his most accessible and influential works, books that carried his systematic vision out into the world to explain its value and uncover its ultimate source. His first major public-facing argument came in a series of broadcast lectures later published as The Educated Imagination. Here, Frye articulates a powerful defense of literary study as a fundamental human necessity. He posits two distinct yet interacting worlds. There is the objective world of nature and reason, the world that science studies and technology attempts to master. Then there is the imaginative world, the one built out of human desire. This second world, the verbal universe of literature, presents us with visions shaped by our deepest hopes and fears. It is a world where gods triumph, where lovers are united, where justice prevails, and where the tragic hero confronts a destiny larger than life. The study of literature, for Frye, is the process of learning the language and grammar of this imaginative world. An educated imagination is one that has absorbed these models, these archetypal patterns of what is humanly conceivable. The social function of this education becomes clear. A society whose imagination is starved or fed only on the cliches and propaganda of the moment is a society that can conceive a few alternatives to its present condition. It becomes trapped in what Frye called the doodlebug stage of existence, reacting to immediate stimuli without a larger vision. An educated imagination equips a populace with a rich storehouse of models for living. It has seen countless worlds built, destroyed, and rebuilt in narrative. It understands the forms of tragedy, comedy, romance, and irony, and can recognize these patterns playing out in its own social and political life. This imaginative training provides a kind of immunity to demagoguery and a capacity for genuine social creation. It allows citizens to ask the crucial question, what kind of society do we want to live in? The answer comes from the world of desire, the world that literature continuously builds and holds up for our inspection. This vision casts the literary critic and the literature teacher in a vital civic role as custodians and interpreters of society's imaginative potential. With the social utility of the literary universe established, a final monumental question remained. If all of Western literature draws from a common pool of archetypes, plots, and symbols, the very ones cataloged in the Anatomy of Criticism, Then where did that pool originate? What is the foundational text, the central repository of this imaginative DNA? Frye's quest for this source led him to the work that would become his great intellectual capstone, the great code of the Bible and literature. In this work, he undertook a breathtakingly ambitious task to read the Bible as the mythological grammar of the entire Western literary tradition. He approached the scriptures with the tools of a literary critic, bracketing questions of divine inspiration or historical accuracy as concerns for other disciplines. His interest was in the Bible's structure, its imagery, and its narrative unity. He saw it as a single, immense book, a divine comedy in its own right that unfolds in a vast U-shaped narrative. The story begins with humanity in a state of idyllic unity with God in Eden, descends through the fall, exile, and bondage of history, and ascends again toward a final state of restored unity and apocalyptic revelation. This double mirror structure, a cycle of creation, fall, redemption, and apocalypse, provides the master plot. Within it, Frye identified a consistent, evolving typology, where figures and events in the Old Testament prefigure those in the New. Adam is a type of Christ. The escape from Egypt prefigures spiritual salvation. This typological and narrative structure, Frye argued, furnished Western culture with its primary imaginative categories. The language of the Bible, rich with metaphors of shepherds, vines, light and darkness, cities and gardens, became the symbolic language of subsequent poetry and prose. The biblical narrative provided the archetypal plots of the quest, the sacrificial tragedy, the tale of the outcast, and the promised land. In Frye's view, a writer like Milton or Blake or Faulkner was consciously or unconsciously working with this inherited code. They were deploying its symbols and reconfiguring its narrative patterns. To understand Western literature fully, one had to understand its great code. The anatomy had been the map of the literary territory. The great code revealed the geological bedrock from which the territory had been formed. This grand synthesis, viewing a central cultural text as an organizing structural system, had profound implications. It demonstrated how a structuralist approach could yield powerful insights into the deep continuities of a civilization's imaginative life. His work resonated with the broader intellectual movements of comparative mythology and meteor studies, fields that likewise seek to uncover the underlying patterns and grammars that shape human expression across different cultures and technologies. His colleague at the University of Toronto, Marshall McLuhan, was exploring the structural effects of meteor on consciousness, and a common interest in the formal structures that govern human perception connected their distinct approaches. Frye's project showed that a culture's stories could be analyzed with a rigor that revealed a coherent, deeply ordered system at their heart. He had moved from mapping the literary world to explaining its purpose for society, and finally, to identifying its foundational charter, completing an intellectual journey of unparalleled scope and ambition. The completion of this intellectual journey left behind an edifice of thought breathtaking in its architectural coherence. Frye's life's work stands as perhaps the last great modernist attempt to construct a total system for the humanities, a grand unified theory for the products of the literary imagination. His ambition was profoundly scientific in spirit, to grant literary studies an objective methodology in a defined field of knowledge, establishing it upon principles independent of subjective taste and impressionistic commentary. He sought to create for criticism what Linnaeus had created for biology, a comprehensive taxonomy and morphology of forms, an anatomy of narrative itself. The result was a stunningly intricate map of the literary universe, where every story, from the most ephemeral folktale to the most complex epic, could find its place within a recurring, cyclical pattern of archetypes and modes. This system promised a synoptic vision, a way to see the whole of literature as a single, self-contained verbal order and autonomous world with its own laws and its own internal logic. It was an intellectual achievement of immense power and elegance, offering a sense of mastery over the seemingly chaotic expanse of human storytelling. As this monumental structure was being completed, the intellectual ground of the Academy was itself shifting. New paradigms for thought were emerging, bringing with them different questions and alternative analytical instruments. These subsequent intellectual movements developed their own powerful lenses for examining cultural artifacts, lenses that would refract Frye's universal archetypes in challenging and unexpected ways. The world of literary theory became a landscape of competing visions, each offering a compelling explanation for the origins and functions of art. The very premises of a stable, universal, and autonomous literary structure came under intense scrutiny from perspectives grounded in linguistics, political economy, and a renewed engagement with the archives of history. The inquiry expanded from defining literature's timeless form to examining its function within the dynamic and often contentious fields of power, language, and society. From the direction of post-structuralist thought, the challenge was fundamental, aimed at the very foundations of Frye's system. Thinkers following in the wake of Ferdinand de Saussure and Jacques Derrida grew deeply suspicious of any system claiming a stable center or a fixed, overarching structure. To them, Frye's quest for the anagogic vision, the ultimate unity of all images in a divine or human imaginative body, appeared as a classic example of Western logocentrism, the persistent desire for a transcendental signified that could anchor the endless play of language. They perceived his elegant binaries, such as comedy and tragedy or romance and irony, as hierarchical oppositions that could be deconstructed, their seeming stability revealed as a product of rhetorical convention. The very idea of an archetype, a recurring symbol with a constant core of meaning, was reimagined as a site of linguistic instability, its significance perpetually deferred, always dependent on its relationship with other signs within a specific textual system. The pursuit of a total, coherent map of literature was supplanted by an exploration of the map's own internal contradictions and the inherent slipperiness of the language used to draw it. A different, though equally potent, critique emerged from scholars employing the tools of Marxist and materialist analysis. For critics like Frederick Jameson and Terry Eagleton, literature was inextricably bound to the material conditions of its production, a product of history, ideology, and class struggle. From this vantage, Frye's grand, trench historical scheme appeared as a profound mystification. His focus on timeless myths and universal cycles seemed to perform an ideological function, lifting literature out of the messy, conflicted world of human history and placing it in a serene, eternal realm of form. When Frye's Anatomy described comedy as a genre that ends in the integration of the hero into a renewed society, the materialist critic would ask whose society, which class is being integrated, and at whose expense. The archetypal patterns he identified were reinterpreted as ideological formations, ways of naturalizing the values of a particular social order by presenting them as the universal desires of humanity. The entire project, with its systematic elegance, was seen as a powerful means of containing the political and historical energies of literature within a formalist, apolitical framework. This concern with the concrete particulars of history found its most forceful expression in the rise of new historicism. Scholars like Stephen Greenblatt proposed a poetics of culture, arguing that literary works were one element among many circulating within a complex network of social practices, discourses, and power relations. Their method involved a deep dive into the archetypes, juxtaposing canonical plays with forgotten pamphlets, medical treatises, and legal documents to reveal the intricate ways in which culture is negotiated and meaning is produced. The new historicists sought the unique, the anecdotal, and the contingent detail that illuminated the specific moment. Frye's work pursued universal patterns that transcended any particular historical context. They were interested in the circulation of social energy, the way texts absorb and redirect the anxieties and aspirations of their time. This perspective dismantled the idea of literature as an autonomous verbal universe, recasting it as an active participant in the construction of historical reality. The critic's task became one of thick description, of uncovering the local, specific, and often surprising connections that tie a text to its world. What endures, then, from Frye's monumental undertaking is a legacy defined by this profound and generative tension. His work represents one of the most compelling articulations of the human intellect's desire for order, system, and totality. It speaks to a deep-seated longing to believe that the products of our imagination are part of a coherent, intelligible, and ultimately meaningful cosmos. Powerful countercurrents of modern thought emphasize contingency, the shaping force of historical particularity, the endless play of difference, and the entanglement of all art with structures of power. Frye gave us the beautiful, intricate clockwork of mythos and diameter, a vision of literature as a perfectly balanced engine of the human spirit. His critics took the clock apart, showing us that its gears were forged in the fires of history, and its movements were lubricated by ideology. The ultimate value of Frye's system may lie in the very grandeur of its reach and the clarity of the questions it provokes. His work forces us to confront a fundamental query about the nature of our own inquiry, questioning whether our search for a science of human imagination leads to discovering the timeless laws of art, or to revealing the powerful architecture of our own desire for a world more ordered than the one we inhabit.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.